Hello, this is Michael Brendan Doherty from National Review, and I'm here with Douglas Murray, the author of The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Islam, and Identity. Douglas, welcome.
Very good to be with you.
Thank you. Douglas, you've authored several books, but this one I think is the one causing the most controversy and the greatest sales. First, just for people who don't know you, just give us a little description of your background and why you chose to write this book.
Sure. I'm a journalist and author, have been since I started out pretty much. I wrote my first book, which was a literary biography when I was quite young. It came out whilst I was at Oxford. And since then I've gone from writing about literature to writing about politics and written about security issues, terrorism, Northern Ireland, and now Europe. And I suppose the one thing they all have in common is, first of all, they're all books about subjects which have galvanized me and indeed obsessed me, and also to some extent books about things that people sort of don't want you to say and know about and write about, and difficult stories, as it were.
Well, at this point, I think this year and in these months, everyone knows the problem you're addressing. I mean, every few days, it seems, there's a headline screeching out of Europe, the Manchester bombing, a London bridge, and before that, a year in France of one terror incident after another. Just for some listeners who don't know, can you give just a quick sense of the scale of immigration from the Muslim world into Europe over your lifetime, and then particularly over the last 2 years since Angela Merkel's big invite?
Well, it's a huge story. I mean, I lay out the history in the early chapters of my book. To give you an example, I say at one point, everybody knows the famous speech of Enoch Powell's, the so-called Rivers of Blood speech, in 1968. If in 1968 you'd have said to Enoch Powell, you'd have been his speechwriter, and you'd said, Enoch, I've got a great idea for your speech. Why don't you say that in 2011 the census will find that people who identified as white British were a minority in London? Enoch Powell would have said, what are you doing? You're trying to make me look like a crazy man. Why don't you let me do my Rivers of Blood speech? Be warmly received. And this is what happened. In 2011, the census showed that in 23 out of 33 London boroughs, people identified as white British were in a minority. Now, there are obviously all sorts of things about that there are absolutely no problem with, all sorts of things about that that are good, and all sorts of things which are inevitably going to be downsides, including cultural changes and idea changes which come in its wake. Now, I think this is just a version of something that's happened across the continent, and what happened in 2015, which is one of the central points of the book, with the invitation by Angela Merkel basically to the entire world, was an extraordinary thing. She thought that she was opening the doors of Europe to asylum seekers, but by the EU's own admission, within months, most of the people who went in 2015 through the external borders of Europe, which had basically disappeared, were people who had no more right to be in Europe than anyone else in the world, demanding then the question, who is Europe for? Who is our continent for? Can it be for the entire world?
Well, what's interesting about your book, too, is you bring up this, it is not just one of a series of books that have come out over the last decade or so that go through the numbers, but you also go through the ideas in Europe.
Yes.
And one of the things that's interesting, that would be interesting to, I think, American listeners is, you talk about some of the justifications that have been made for this mass immigration. And one that would be unfamiliar to Americans is this idea that that Europe deserves to be punished.
Yes.
It's something that I've heard you talk about, or Roger Scruton and other Europeans. What does that come from? Because in America, diversity is just an unqualified blessing.
I think you have a small version of it, if I can say so, as an observer of your society. I give some examples of that in the book. It's my belief that the West in general has fallen for a sense of guilt that the rest of the world does not share and does not follow itself. Obviously, we've got the worst versions of that you can see in Germany, and for legitimate reasons. Sort of Holocaust guilt, however, has spread across Europe as a whole. And I think that guilt, including the founding guilts of colonialism, exists very strongly. But these also come here. I mean, I mentioned in the book that in recent 20 or 30 years in particular, I've noticed that in America, you have versions of this. You know, I think the idea that America suffers from original sin, that you were sort of wicked from the beginning, that you destroyed Eden, that Columbus destroyed Eden, and that you could see. I've just finished reading Naomi Klein's new book, and she is the absolutely classic thing in her thing is that basically, if it hadn't have been for the awful Europeans who created the awful Americans, you know, America would be wonderful.
It's a fascinating thing. You talk a little bit about how the spread of German guilt around the continent, that even somehow all of Europe did the Holocaust.
Yes.
And it seems that each Western European society can invent some version of this idea that their society needs to be deconstructed and rebuilt again.
Yes, I mean, and that we are rather boring, staid places. I mean, no one. It's a sort of commonplace that you say that we need this because it's interesting. You know, who wouldn't want more Eritreans to bring us their cultural gifts? And of course, the reverse is never true. I mean, no one ever says what Eritrea really needs is an influx of people from Wales who could bring a whole range of culinary delights and familial pleasures into this rather boring African country. I mean, you never hear that, and for good reason, because it's very insulting.
Where do you see this debate going? I mean, I think you're witnessing the reception that your own book is getting in a time where these questions are as hot as they've ever been.
Yes.
And you know, I think you and I both maybe tend toward the pessimistic view of the near-term future. But where do you see it going? Because it does seem that, in a way, maybe more and more people are waking up to the idea that, you know, they see the Muslim communities building up around a ring of suburbs around Paris, and they think they're not falling into the Michel Houellebecq idea that this is a revivifying force for our national culture and something we can learn from. So where is it actually going?
I think it's going to go very bad in the immediate future. There's no need to be an optimist about it because the evidence doesn't point that way. And as Roger Scruton, you mentioned earlier, famously said, you know, I mean, there's a lot of damage that's been done by optimists, so there's no need to get high on the same stuff as they have. I think it's going to be very bad in the short term. I think that recent attacks across Europe show that. But of course, we have to try to find a way out. Toward the end of my book, I give a couple of chapters of what I think would be, broadly speaking, answers. Some of them are very practical. How to stem the flow, for instance, of people into Europe, which is obviously the first thing that needs to happen. But also, you know, I try to challenge my readers to address also what it is about us that we need to be more serious about. And I think this is something everybody, quite often readers have said to me and written to me saying, but, you know, what can we do, as it were? And I've had that for some years. And in this book, I try in part to say to people what I think, you know, helping to rebuild a serious culture consists of, and the level of seriousness we should have towards it. By the way, it's no surprise to me that my critics have totally failed to pick up this challenge. They almost just refuse to do it. But I do think this is absolutely vital. After all, if you are to rouse yourself to a defense of your culture, you need to live in your culture and enjoy it and celebrate it and also know its depths. We have been, I say in the introduction to my book, we've done this strange thing in recent years of, because we've needed to attract, because we've needed to sort of encompass the whole world, because the whole world has come to our societies, we've had to make very shallow self-definitions apply. You know, our societies are about being nice, for instance, or about being tolerant or diverse. And that's a very, very shallow, unnecessarily shallow definition. It's necessarily shallow because it's so wide. I think we have to bring ourselves to, among other things, saying what we don't want as well as what we do, to acknowledge that the language of inclusion also demands the language of exclusion. It demands that you say what you will not tolerate and what you will do about that, as well as what you love and what you wish to protect.
So it's an interesting way to look at it. You know, one argument that has kind of gained steam, and I think it might be one of the last ones to address. But among American pundits, there's an argument now that, well, terrorism isn't really a serious issue. That, it kills a negligible amount of people, and that, you're as likely to die from your underwear or from some lawn statue that falls upon you as a terrorist. That the only real danger is Islamophobia itself. It's kind of become the argument of the juice box set over here, we say. What would you say to those who look at the headlines of Europe and in a sense say, well, the important thing to do here is shrug?
Yes. Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? First of all, I mean, the obvious thing that you hear these statistics, they're passed around by sort of giggly liberals after every attack. You're more likely to be killed by your toaster or your lawnmower. Ha ha ha. Well, if you discovered that your toaster or lawnmower killed you and badly, injured you or killed your wife, and you found out the factory was deliberately wiring toasters or lawnmowers in order to kill their owners, you would feel legitimately annoyed. And we are talking here about a deliberate miswiring of people to make them hate us. And that should be given some attention, and we shouldn't simply giggle it away. The second thing is, of course, it only works for a bit, that kind of argument. You've got to make sure you don't, for instance, choose Paris in 2015 as your litmus test, or New York in 2001. And the bigger problem about this is, as you say, that people people see certain attacks as being more serious than others. We just had, as we're speaking, the first effectively sort of seems revenge-like attack, horrible as it is to use such a term, of an attack by somebody, it appears, on Muslim worshippers coming out of a mosque in London. And there's an enormous willingness, and quite rightly, to find out why somebody would have done something so appalling and unforgivable and violent. But we just need to apply the same rigor and concern to every attack and find out who's teaching the Islamists to do what they do, where they get their support from. And that, I'm afraid, society would seem at the moment not to be willing to do. And I think that in the short term, that's a very, very big warning sign of the problems we've got coming ahead in the long term.
On that pretty grim note, this is Douglas Murray, the author of The Strange Death of Europe, which is available soon at booksellers all over the United States, supply permitting. And I am Michael Brennan Doherty for National Review. Thank you so much, Douglas.
It's a great pleasure.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.